Now, the International Monetary Fund, together with the World Bank Group, has begun its annual spring meetings. Central bankers, ministers of finance and development, parliamentarians, private sector executives, as well as academics from around the world will attend the week-long meeting in Washington. Now, this year's gathering will table issues of global concern. These include the world economic outlook, poverty eradication, economic development, and the effectiveness of aid. Well, let's discuss this expectations for this year's meetings further. Ollie Barrett joins us again in Washington. Ollie, very welcome back to the show. Now, there are certainly many urgent matters we're going to see discussed at this year's meeting. Trade disputes, of course, faltering global growth, volatile world markets, tension in the Middle East, you name it, it's quite a long list. What issues, Ollie, do you think will likely dominate this year's meeting?
Well, all of the above, all of those issues that you mentioned will certainly be at the forefront of the minds of the many dignitaries, officials, government ministers and leaders and diplomats and business people who are descending on Washington for these meetings, but more issues beyond that as well. The issue around digital currencies, digital financial digitalization, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, issues around economic inequality and division, the idea around US leadership or lack of in international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Certainly, though, right at the top of the agenda for many of the people attending these meetings here in Washington this week will be the backdrop that we have of that ongoing trade row between China and the United States and the prospect of that potentially even getting worse than it has already got. That will be one of the key items on the agenda here in Washington that many of the attendees will want to get to the bottom of and try and potentially have some impact on.
Now, Ollie, last week, Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, said there were darker clouds looming for the global economy. So how exactly, or rather how high are the stakes for this year's meeting, especially on issues such as trade?
Very high indeed. These meetings certainly come at a perfect time in many ways for officials to be able to try and grapple with some of the issues we've been discussing. Christine Lagarde, as you say, suggesting that there are some gloomier pictures emerging when it comes to the global economy, which had been in pretty fine shape over the previous year or so in many parts of the world. Certainly that row between China and the United States over trade, the prospect of a growing trade war, make that picture slightly gloomier further still. But there's also the fact, of course, the contradiction in all of this is that some of the times we've seen financial markets around the world being rattled in recent months has been at the prospect of the US and other countries raising interest rates because their economies are actually growing pretty well. So it's certainly a mixed picture. There are parts of the world where growth is still strong, where unemployment is coming down, but there are certainly clouds on the horizon in places as well.
In that case, Ollie, we know the IMF did predict back in January that global growth will be at about 3.9%. Given the current state of the global economy and certainly all these issues, do you expect to see forecasts change significantly? Of course, they will be releasing their new estimates tomorrow. So do you expect to see huge changes there?
It's certainly possible that we will see some revisions. One thing is certain in all of this is that the IMF almost always has to revise its own forecasts. It doesn't have a particularly good record in this area at predicting global growth and often does have to go back and change its forecasting. Certainly there might be some revisions coming down the track, particularly with this growing trade dispute between China and the United States. That is one of the issues that many economists feel could have a negative impact on global growth as we go into the coming year or so. So yes, the prospect of a downward revision when it comes to economic growth forecasts for global growth, but also for various regions of the world. That's a realistic prospect.
Well, many thanks, Ollie, for your insights. Of course, Ollie Barrett joining us there in Washington.